Okay, 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Order, order. I call Dave Robertson to move the motion.
Thank you, Dr. Hook. Can I say before I begin my remarks what a pleasure it will be to serve in a debate with you in the chair this afternoon. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 700824 relating to immigration. This is a topic of real importance. It matters to an awful lot of people across Britain, but I think too often, actually, politicians fail to talk about this with the seriousness and the depth that it deserves. Views in immigration in the country have become increasingly polarised, and it's a sad fact that I know for a fact that at the close of today's debate, I will receive hate mail, as I'm sure many of the members around the chamber will do today. Some of that will be from people who think that because I'm willing to talk about the rapid rise in immigration in the country, that I'm somehow a racist. But actually some of that will also come from people who think that I'm the worst example of woke thinking, whatever that is, and I'm a soft touch and I don't care about the country's national security. Now, neither of those positions is right. And actually, when I talk to people, face to face, and you actually talk to real life people who aren't in politics, actually, I come across very, very, very few people who hold either of those essentially polarised opinions. One of the things I'm really hoping from today's debate is that we can bridge that gap and start to talk frankly and fairly about this issue. Everybody in this room today wants to make progress on this issue, and I would hope that actually honourable and right honourable members around the room will bear that in mind and that we can have a positive and open discussion, a grown-up debate that is the one that this country deserves. When we do think about immigration, though, there are two things that are really clear to me. First, actually, for centuries, the role that migrants have played in making this country what it is today. My notes here go back as far as Romans, Anglos, Saxons, Jutes, Normans, Flemings, Irish, the Windrush generation, people from across the Commonwealth, I'm running out of breath, and countless others, actually. I think it would be really remiss of me not to go through that list and not actually pay particular mention of the contribution of the millions from across the Commonwealth and further afield who fought shoulder to shoulder with our soldiers in both of the world wars in the last century, and not only that, but helped win the peace afterwards. The second thing that we need to do, though, is respond to that by saying that in recent years, immigration in Britain has grown rapidly. In the years since the COVID-19 pandemic, it has spiked dramatically. And it is very clear to, I'm sure, all of us in the chamber and certainly to the 219,000 people who signed this petition that it is a worry for a lot of people. Voters consistently tell pollsters that immigration is one of the biggest issues that we face, and the most recent survey by YouGov finds that 69% of people think immigration has been too high over the past decade. The worry that migration figures have grown too quickly is what I think underpins this petition. And I know when I mentioned that I was going to be leading this debate, I spoke to somebody back home, and their view was that actually, because it starts with the idea of close the borders, you should just try and ridicule somebody. And that is absolutely the wrong approach to take in this situation, I think. I think when you look into the detail of this petition, when you look into the explanatory notes and what they've written, actually their real drive here is not about trade, it's not about imports, it's very much about the issue of immigration. And I really don't want to try and patronise anybody by picking a particular point and trying to make ridiculous comments about it. Unfortunately, it has been a little bit more difficult to prepare for this introduction because it's common practice when I've introduced petitions debates before that one of the first people I speak to about it is the petitioner themselves. And I think that's really valuable when I've done it in the past, to be able to speak to that person face to face or via Zoom, in fact, and really see where they're coming from and hopefully build that around that. Unfortunately, the petitioner themselves haven't been able to respond to any of the requests for a meeting, so I haven't been able to have that face to face. So I'm going to try and do the very best that I can to do justice to their petition and talk about it in as much detail as possible. The petition itself calls for a temporary halt to all immigration, both illegal and legal, for 5 years. And I think that word temporary is so important in there. The petitioner writes that our country is facing serious challenges from both legal and illegal immigration and argues that strong action is needed. And I think what that speaks to is a sense that we've reached a moment of crisis. This petition is not saying never again. They are not dismissing the contribution that migrants make to our society, but they are worried where we are right now. And if I go back to that initial point that I made about wanting to have a grown-up debate here, I think it's really important that we recognise this is not somebody who is just saying no people who weren't born here. It's actually as a response to the situation as they see it. So where exactly are we? I think it's important that actually, if I'm going to have the opportunity to present a debate, let's present some facts to go around it. Since 2021, immigration to Britain has risen to unprecedented levels. Net migration, so the total number of people who are moving here, take away the total number of people who've left, was well in excess of 750,000 in the 12 months to June 2024. Now, that's down on the previous year, but it is still vastly higher than the pre-pandemic estimate, which would have been closer to 750,000. Now, within that, actually, it's 1.2 million people moving to the UK. 5% of those were Brits moving home. That's people who were living elsewhere who've come home. Now, I don't think for a million years that the petitioner would say that people who were born in the UK wouldn't have a right to come back. I don't think that's where it's coming from. But in the numbers that we see that are produced, that does count as somebody who's immigrating to the UK because it's an inward flow. Another 10% of those who came were from the EU, plus Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Switzerland, although actually more people from those countries left Britain than arrived. The vast majority, about 1 million people, were non-EU nationals. Almost half, just about 400,000, came here to work. Around 375,000 were asylum seekers, and roughly 150,000 were asylum seekers or people coming through specific humanitarian schemes. The Ukrainians and the Hong Kong national schemes are great examples of that. And again, I'm sure there's widespread consensus about the importance of maintaining those safe and legal routes. Of the remainder, around about 100,000 people, most of those came for family reasons, which again is, I think, something that most people would support, people's right to live a proper family life. The petition talks about both legal and illegal immigration. The vast majority of people arriving in this country do through standard legal routes. They have a work permit or a student visa or some type of permission. But we all know that there are a large number of people who come to the country through what the government calls irregular routes, most of them by crossing the English Channel in small boats. Of those people, around 94% go on to claim asylum and around 70% are successful, which is actually a similar proportion to those who arrive through other routes. In the year to September 2024, just under 30,000 people arrived by small boats. This is down by a third from a peak of more than 45,000 in 2022, but still much higher than we've seen before that. In fact, it's almost 100 times. Now, that's not 100%, that's 100 times higher than it was in 2018. However you look at it, that is a really, really bad thing. The English Channel may only be 20 miles at its narrowest points, but in boats like we see people trying to use to cross it, those journeys can be extremely, extremely dangerous. That is one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet, and it is a very dangerous crossing. By October last year, 2021 had already become the deadliest for channel crossings on record, and 69 people died trying to reach our country. Those are lives that should never have been lost. The people who profit from that are those organised criminal gangs that are prepared to put profit in the way of people's safeties. Given that background, I think it's quite important that we do debate this petition in full and in detail and openly. As part of the work behind presenting this opening speech, I spoke to a wide range of stakeholders who actually said that it would be possible, as a policy choice, this would be possible, but it would have impacts. And I think that's something that, again, is very worth saying, is that actually, potentially, this is doable. But you have to go one step further when you're a legislator and talk about what effect would that have. Before I carry on, actually, can I just thank everyone who shared their time and knowledge to help make this debate as informed and as useful as possible. The Centre for Policy Studies, the Migration Observatory at Oxford University, and the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. When we talk about the effects that introducing this policy might have, let's start talking about work. What would it mean for jobs and our economy to stop that immigration completely, even if just for 5 years? The polling suggests that right now the only factor that worries Brits more than immigration is the economy, for obvious reasons. So thinking about the impact that immigration has on jobs is a huge part of where this debate should be going. One of the big worries that voters have is that migrants take jobs that could otherwise be done by Brits and drive down wages in our economy. Now, anybody who knows anything about economics will know that there's no fixed number of jobs in Britain, and that because we have the advantages of living in a liberal free market economy, the number of jobs rises in good times when money of people got spent, and in those bad times, I will of course give way.
I'm loath to interrupt his short seminar on economics, but let me add my thoughts to it. Everyone has an economic value and an economic cost. So people who arrive in Britain bring an economic value. Some bring great value, people with skills that we need and so on. Some bring much more cost than value. So if they bring dependents, for example, elderly relatives, young children, they need to be educated, need healthcare, they bring very little economic value. That's not to say they're not valuable people, they may well be. So in terms of the economic argument, is the honourable gentleman as alarmed as I am about the high number of dependents who bring no economic value to the country that immigrants bring with them?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. There are actually a couple of those points which I was about to pick up on, but I think the major thrust of what he was saying was around dependents who don't bring any economic value. I think if we're particularly talking about dependents who are children, I think we have to consider the future economic value of actually having potentially amazing people come into the country with potentially amazing skills who can deliver wonderful things for our country. But back to the kind of wider point around actually what would this mean around the job market, I think it is one very worth discussing. Migrants don't take jobs from a fixed pool. The simple fact that actually when people migrate to the UK, they spend money. A rise in population can mean more cash in the economy, more money for businesses, allowing to expand and create more jobs for those people who've come to the UK. But the reality is that the impact migration has on the economy is actually quite small. Migrants do overall make our GDP bigger, that's a fact, but it's not actually by a vast amount. It's not a silver bullet to more jobs, higher wages and boom times. And when you think about it, that's pretty unsurprising, because if immigration was doing all that, I don't think many of the people would be quite as worried about it as they are. The other part is around wages, because actually that's another thing that comes up when you talk to people about this. They are very interested in saying that actually, although it may have an impact on GDP, what's it doing to the wages that people are able to earn? For the most part, looking across the economy as a whole, all of the measures say that the answer is very little. Very difficult to measure. It's such a small value that it's difficult to put a number on. Experts find that wages aren't substantially higher or lower because of migrants. But I think most of us also know that the economy isn't really about, people's understanding of the economy isn't really about a number written on a spreadsheet somewhere that an economist is looking at. It's about, do I have a job? Does it pay well? Do I have enough to get by? And the one place that immigration does have an impact is for the lowest paid workers. For those people, it does have a, admittedly small, but it does depress pay ever so slightly. Now, it's very easy for us to say that, but if you're struggling to make ends meet anyway, any impact on your wages in the wrong direction is a really big deal. Beyond that, if we're talking about immigration and jobs and the economy, I think we have to talk about what sectors of the economy that really rely on migrants. Because there are many, many sectors in our economy that struggle to fill jobs with British workers. Lots and lots and lots of industries. The ones that I'm going to single out, though, are seasonal agricultural work, like fruit picking, and care work. Two sectors where migrants make up a big share of the workforce. And if we look at care specifically, in England, which is where I'll start, carers are often paid less than you'd get working in a warehouse for one of these large internet companies. I won't name the one that begins with an A. Or if you're working as a delivery driver or your local supermarket. And actually that can make care work really unattractive to people. And people who do want to be carers are doing that not only for the pay at the end of the month, but also because they really enjoy looking after people who need that support and need that help, older people, disabled or the vulnerable. As a result, almost 1 in 5 carers in the UK are migrant workers. And for them, the wages are better than they might get at home. But what's really interesting is comparing that to Scotland and Northern Ireland, where actually there are far fewer migrant carers, and that's because wages for carers are higher in those areas. So in that situation, they're attracting more British workers and there's less of a drive to employ migrant workers. the Migration Advisory Committee reckons that actually raising the wages of carers by £1 an hour would make the job much more attractive to English workers, beating out those other jobs that currently pay more. And that's where we can talk about this being a policy choice. It is down to any government to make those policy choices. They could choose to do that investment. It would be somewhere around £2 billion a year, which would enable that to happen, but it would potentially leave unfilled jobs in other key sectors or other areas unable to find the labour that they need. Last couple of points before I do shut up and let other people contribute, but I think it's important that we do talk about public services. Immigration will have an effect on that because and I think everybody actually recognises that it's an obvious difference that people see. More people registering for doctors, more people registering for dentists, needing hospital treatment, sending their children to school, using public services. But it does also mean more people paying tax to pay for those things. So it's not quite a good or bad argument. It's one that we have to have in the round. And actually, if you look at migrants, particularly those highly paid migrants, as the honourable member mentioned earlier, they actually tend to pay more in tax than they take out in using those services. But there are other areas where the impact isn't quite as offset in the same way, where more people just does make things harder. Housing is the most obvious example there. We know that we have a housing crisis in the country. There's widespread political consensus about that. Rents are rising. People are paying eye-watering sums for a house to own. And it's becoming much harder to get out of the private rental sector and onto the housing ladder. Because migration increases our population, it means more competition for homes and potentially even higher prices. Now, the irony is, in the short term, we need skilled construction workers to come here and start building those homes because we have a gap in those skills in Britain. But if the population rises faster than we can build the housing, it's going to exacerbate what is already a crisis. Earlier on, I spoke about the number of people coming to live in the UK on student visas, and I think it's important that I go into a little bit more detail on that now. Some of us and some people I've spoken to may not consider international students as migrants, but they do appear in the numbers as that. And actually, almost a third of migrants to the country last year came here to study. The international education strategies set by the previous government aimed to increase the number of international students studying in the UK to 600,000 by 2030. Those students do pay higher fees, which helps pay for the world-class research universities that we have in the UK, one of the things that I'm sure all members and right honourable members are very proud to support. And international students make up roughly a quarter of all students in British universities, from closer to about 10% all those years ago when I was there. Some of our universities, though, the share is much higher. International students make up more than half of the total at Imperial, UCL, BPP, Coventry, Edinburgh and Southampton. Now, the number of international students is already starting to fall because they're no longer allowed to bring dependents with them or switch to a work visa before the end of their course. Applications were down by almost a third last year. And that means we have another difficult choice: either raise the fees that British students pay to help balance the books, or potentially remove funding from the university sector that's so important to the economy and to our soft power. Cardiff University has already announced plans to cut 400 jobs and ACTS courses due to fewer international students' applications. It is already starting to have an effect. For some, fewer international students could end up leading to them going under. The final point that I want to make before I conclude is around culture. And I think this is a much more difficult one to tie down because a lot of voters, when they talk to us, talk about the culture that people are bringing and the impact that potentially high levels of immigration has on British culture and the kind of country that Britain is. I think all of us know that there are lots of versions of Britishness, and that trying to tie down a definition of that word would take longer than the 3 hours we have for this debate today. And there are people in this country who are totally chalk and cheese, who we love and we loathe, and different groups who really identify with others and who really don't. And again, we could spend a long time talking about that idea on its own. Yet at the same time, there is this shared sense of what it means to be British, and that's not just where you were born, and it's not just the colour of a passport. It's something much more fundamental that people do share. It's fuzzy, it's hard to define, but we do know it. And for lots of people in this country, Britishness isn't the only part of who they are, whether they're a third-generation immigrant or somebody newly arrived here. It's not a zero-sum game. You can't just be British and nothing else. It's perfectly legitimate for people to feel British American, British Canadian, British Nigerian, British Indian, British Pakistani. That's perfectly legitimate. And actually, that dual nationality and the approaches that people have brought to the country has brought amazing developments in the last centuries. And I think it's something that a lot of us would want to celebrate. Although actually, for a lot of people, whilst a lot of people see the vibrancy and new cultural ideas, new foods, new music, different businesses to the high street are great, there are also some people who feel that with hesitation. They feel that things are moving too fast for them. And I really believe that actually, when you get to know people who might seem a bit different, we tend to find we have a lot more common than we think at first. When we break down those barriers and get to know our neighbours, it can leave people feeling closer, feeling a bigger sense of community. But actually, if that work isn't done and that people don't feel they can break down those barriers, they can feel more isolated, more distant, more nervous, and like their community is changing in ways that they didn't agree to and that they can't control. Now, I feel I do need to say here that there are a minority of people in this country, and it is a minority of people in this country who have views on race and views on immigration that we should all condemn. And there are, unfortunately, some people who will use debates like this to try and further their own poisonous goals. But I also think that actually, in this space, there are a lot of people who feel very nervous discussing that. And they are very nervous about being dismissed as being racist, even though they don't come from a place that they consider to be racist. And that's why I'll go back to that initial point about let's have a grown-up discussion, let's talk about this in the round, let's recognise that not everybody starts from the same place, and let's recognise that if we want to get this right, and people do want to get this right, that we're going to have to build a consensus, we're going to have to build bridges, we're going to have to work with everybody in our community, whether that's the settled population, whether it's different parts of the settled population, whether it's migrants, whether it's expats, or any other list of words that I could go on forever. There's clearly a mood in the country that immigration is too high. I think it tells us something about how Brits are feeling about our country. It speaks to everything that the UK has to offer, that so many people want to choose to make their lives here and share in our greatest British values. But it's hard for some people to feel proud and optimistic about that when they look around and they see shut shops, where jobs in their town, city or village don't pay well despite the long hours, if you can't see a doctor or a dentist, or if you can't afford to pay your rent or even dream of buying a house. Fixing those problems is hard and is complicated. Ending immigration is a policy choice that somebody can make, a government can choose to make that, but it won't be a silver bullet to fix all of those. And if that's a decision that any government chooses to make, they would have to do so in full knowledge of the impact that that would have, potentially in unseen ways. But what this petition demonstrates more than anything is that the fear right now is where we are, things need to change, and that people are really eager to see people like us in this chamber who have the opportunity to speak about this, talk about this in a way that hopefully moves the country forward. Thank you very much, Doctor.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 700824 relating to suspending legal and illegal migration. Can I remind members to stand if they want to speak, and we can do the calculation and work out where we're going next, which in this case is Sir John Hayes.
I'm extremely grateful, Madam Chairman, for being able to contribute to this debate, on which I congratulate the honourable gentleman, not only for bringing it to the House, but for the measured way he introduced it. It's good to hear someone offering a balanced view about immigration, and I have good news for him. I'm not frightened or nervous about speaking about it for fear of being labelled. Indeed, I've been speaking about it for a very long time and will continue to do so. And the plain fact of the matter is that this country has had far too much immigration for far too long. Much of the debate recently has focused on illegal immigration, understandably so. 150,000 people across the Channel, that number's risen since last summer, and people see our borders breached with impunity and perfectly properly regard that as a challenge to the very rule of law. Curious, isn't it, that many of the people now are coming from Vietnam. Before that, it was Albania. There's not much evidence that these people are fleeing from those countries which we know persecute people because they are tyrannical. The truth is that many of them are economic migrants. And let me say a word about that, Madam Chairman, because if you were in a part of the world which, if not God-forsaken, for nowhere is that, was certainly less advantaged than this one, it would be unsurprising that you'd want a better life for you and your family, and you might well become an economic migrant if you felt you could do so without cost although, of course, in this case, the cost is substantial because they pay people smugglers great sums of money to get here, knowing that once they get here, the chances are they will never leave. C.S. Lewis said that failures are finger posts on the road to achievement. Well, one certainly hopes so, because successive governments have failed to deal with illegal immigration and failed to recognise that legal immigration is a much greater problem still. For all of the awfulness of our borders being breached, the scale of legal migration, the effect that has on population growth, which I shall deal with in a few moments, is so immense that it dwarfs the challenge and problem of those people coming here across the Channel. ONS figures now suggest that our population will surge, and that most of that increase is a direct result of migration. The scale of migration is so great now that it is impossible to build sufficient houses to meet demand. It is impossible to provide health care in the sort of numbers our population is increasing by. Let me give some figures to illustrate my point. In 2023, the net migration of this country, this is not about people coming and leaving, this is the net figure, was 866,000. Even the most ambitious government, a government exceeding all previous records, might build 250,000 houses a year, perhaps 300,000. And the net population growth through migration in a single year was 866,000. The year before, 822,000. The year before, 250, and so on. This is an entirely new phenomenon, by the way. If you look back to the period running up to the mid-90s, migration was basically imbalanced. Some years more people left, some more people arrived. So migration was, broadly speaking, in balance. In an advanced country, people will always come and people will always leave. And it's right they should be able to do so, subject to certain conditions, of course, in terms of the people arriving, that is. But the change, the dramatic change, has swelled our population very rapidly, very quickly. And no country could cope with that sort of population growth without very serious consequences for public services. And I'll turn in a second or two to the other consequences, and the honourable gentleman touched upon them, actually. But let's just deal with the economic arguments, because he rightly said the justification for this has usually been economic. We needed these people to fill jobs that others couldn't do. I can remember when I was in attending the Cabinet, David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, said about his policy to reduce migration to tens of thousands, that it seemed only he and the Home Secretary believed in it, because every time he went to Cabinet, one or more Cabinet Ministers would plead a special case. We need more health workers. We need more construction workers. We need more farm workers. We need more dentists. We need more doctors. We need more nurses. Who don't we need? And in fact, every single department was pleading that they were a special case, such that the policy was almost impossible to pursue, to achieve. And that's the problem we've had. And that problem ignores the point I made to the honourable gentleman. He's right. As I said, he made an extremely balanced case, if I might say so. He's right to say that an enormous number of people are admitting on work visas. From June 2024, 270,000 workers were brought in to work in healthcare. But as a result, they brought 377,000 dependents, almost none of whom would have worked in health or care, many of whom would have depended on the provision of health and care, perfectly understandably. This wasn't meeting an economic need, this was creating an economic demand. I give way to the old gentleman who looks like a bespectacled economist, so I'm slightly nervous.
Thank you. I'm not sure if that was an insult or not, Chair. Firstly, I should declare an interest when we talk about healthcare workers by saying that back in 2015, an overseas healthcare worker did save my life, my cardiologist, and I've put on record my thanks to him. But the honourable gentleman will know is without immigration, population in the UK is falling. And not only is it falling, we're getting older as well, and I'm evidence of that. And without workers coming into the country, particularly for our healthcare system, we would be stuck. Does he not agree with that point?
Well, let's be clear about population. I'll deal with these points in order, if I might. The first thing is on population. The ONS are clear that net migration is likely to fuel a rise in the UK population to 72.5 million by 2032. Now, when I was a child, for most of my childhood and adolescence, population was somewhere around 57, 58, 59 million. We've never, at any point in our history, had a population of anything like 72.5 million, and that growth has been dramatic in about a generation and a half. And so you can never build infrastructure to cope with that kind of growth. No government could. It's not about a Labour government or a Conservative government or a government from a fringe party. By that I mean the Liberal Democrats, of course. It's about the public service being funded in a way that is feasible, that's tenable. And of course it's true that many people who come into the country do great things. Of course it's true that our population has people from all kinds of places of origin who contribute immensely to our well-being and welfare. But the truth is that the healthcare visa scheme was a palpable and absolute failure. Because if you look at the number of vacancies in that sector during the period I've described, it barely moved. It fell slightly. It fell slightly, but by nothing like those numbers. Leaving the question, Madam Chairman, what are the people doing now? And what do they do shortly after they arrive? I have to say that my estimation is that many of them were never intending to work in the healthcare sector and were brought into the country by businesses that never intended to work in it either, in honesty. And so that's just a single example of how the arguments about the economy and the values of the economy need to be re-examined and challenged. I spoke earlier about the economic costs that people bring as well as value, but what I didn't speak of, and must be considered, is the displacement effect that migration has on the investment in skills. I was the skills minister, as you know, Madam Chairman, I beg your pardon, and I helped to rejuvenate the apprenticeship system, and under my stewardship we built the biggest number of apprenticeships we've ever had in modern times. And I did that because I believe in investing in vocational and practical and technical competencies, not only to fulfil economic need, but also because many people's aptitudes, tastes and talents take them in that direction. But when we say to businesses, there's no need to invest in training, in recruitment or retention, because you can bring people in from abroad to do those jobs. What incentive, what possible incentive is there to eat into the number of people who find themselves outside the labour market? You know, young people, particularly, I feel for the number of so-called NEETs, those not in education, employment or training, stubbornly high, but just gone up to about 1 million now. These are 16 to 24-year-olds. They deserve better than a system which says, we won't train you, stay on benefits, because there's someone from elsewhere who will do the job that you might be trained to carry out. That's not good government. It's not reasonable. It's not responsible. And so we have to displace immigration and invest in skills rather than the opposite, which is exactly what we've been doing for so long, again, under successive governments. You'll notice I make no apology for the record of previous Conservative governments. I'm being absolutely frank that this has been a failure by the whole of the political establishment, and indeed much of that establishment, drawn as it is from the liberal classes, misunderstands this argument at all. And the honourable gentleman boldly, actually, and I think accurately, drew attention to the gulf between the views and opinions of a very large number of our constituents, and those who populate organisations like the Migration Advisory Committee. It's a murky group. I never know quite who's on it or how they got there, but certainly they don't seem terribly sensitive to the kind of arguments that the Honourable Gentleman advanced when he talked about the frustration which people feel and the fears they feel about the scale of migration for economic reasons. Now, let me say something about the social consequences, because, again, he touched on this in his opening remarks. He touched on the fact that societies work when they cohere, when they have a shared sense of belonging, which draws them together, which mitigates the differences which inevitably prevail in a free society. And that shared sense of belonging is itself dependent on change being relatively gradual. Of course, everywhere changes, life changes, all of our lives individually change, but we can cope with so much change in a human span, and yet we've seen places alter beyond recognition, towns and parts of cities in our country, and it's hard to reconcile that with the maintenance of that sense of belonging. You need to be able to absorb people. You need to be able to share with those people. You need to welcome those people knowing there is something for them to integrate into. In some parts of Britain, there's precious little left to integrate into. It's not fair to the indigenous population, and it's not fair to the incoming people either. It cheats them of their chance to gain that sense of belonging, that sense of Britishness that the Honourable Gentleman rightly identified as critically important to our collective, our communal well-being. And he's right, that some people are frightened to say that. The people on the Clapham omnibus, I've never been on an omnibus to Clapham. You might have been, Madam Chairman, I haven't, but I can imagine what the people on the Clapham omnibus are like, because they're probably rather like the people on the Spalding omnibus, or even the Boston omnibus. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm most grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. Can I urge him to enjoy the pleasures of taking a bus to Clapham? It's a splendid experience.
I'd like to think that my constituency neighbour spent more time in Lincolnshire than he does in Clapham, but and I'm sure he does. But perhaps we could travel together. Perhaps we could have an outing. Perhaps we could have an outing on the Clapham omnibus together. Because as I go about my constituency, and I imagine it's the same in Lichfield, and it'll be the same in many across this House, I hear the frustrations, the feelings of resentment, actually, that so much harm has been done by so many people in power who've been oblivious to that harm. Now, the last government, very belatedly, and after overtures from people like me and the Honourable Gentleman when he was still in the light before he went into the shade, finally clamped down on some of these abuses. So they cut the number of work visas in a range of sectors. They reduced the number of dependents that students could bring. That was a preposterous thing, wasn't it? That students could come and bring their families. When you go to study somewhere, you don't go to bring your family. You go specifically for an academic purpose. So that was curbed, and it did have some effect on overall numbers, but it was too little too late. It wasn't sufficient, and it took a lot of hand-wringing even to get to that point. Now I've been sort of half kind to the Honourable Gentleman. I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's most generous with his time, especially to a member from a minority party. Thank you for that. But he raises an interesting point about people coming over here to study and bring independence with them. Does he know of any British students that's gone abroad that's took their family with them?
Well, I think the key difference is the type and level of students. I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. The Honourable Gentleman and I really disagree, and we certainly don't disagree about this subject very much. If you're studying for a PhD, so if you're coming to work here for a considerable time, and you're looking to build a long-term career in academia here, I can understand why you might want to build a family life here. If you're coming for a shorter course, a master's course, for example, it's pretty hard to see why you'd want to bring your family when you'd expect to go home at the end of it. And most of those people will be very young. So it's unlikely that they'll have children unlikely that they'll have wives or husbands. So who are these dependents they might be bringing? And I agree with the honourable gentleman. It was preposterous to begin with, and happily in the end we curbed it. I know others want to contribute to the debate, and I don't want to take any longer, except to say this, I suppose, that it's high time that there was a sea change, that we recognise those finger posts on the road to achievement, those failures that successive governments have committed. And whilst I know that an explanation of cause is not a justification by reason, to quote C.S. Lewis again, the cause of this has been a fundamental reluctance to measure the medium and long-term effects of things which in the short term seemed attractive because they dealt with shortages or gaps in the economy. I hope that we can now make the necessary changes. I hope that we can reunite those with power with those who their power effects, that we can re-engage with the population that knows that the premise with which I began my short contribution, that there's been too much immigration into this country for too long, is a widely held view by people who think that enough is enough.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Dr. It is always a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And can I thank my honourable friend for Lichfield and my office buddy for opening this really important debate. This petition demands a 5-year suspension on all immigration. And while I understand the concerns that led to over 200,000 people signing it, if we were to follow what the petitioners are asking for, we would make Liz Truss look like a saint and suck out that rich cultural tapestry that makes our country so great. Migrants make up 1/5 of our workforce. The NHS alone relies on more than 160,000 staff from overseas. Suspend all immigration tomorrow, and who will fill these roles? Who will care for our sick, work on our buses, the Clapham omnibus perhaps, or staff our hospitality sector? Yeah.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. He asks who will fill the skills gap or the labour gap. How about the 7 million people who are economically inactive in this country?
Well, I thank the honourable member for the intervention, and I'm grateful that he's here in the chamber because he's had a busy weekend, so it's nice to see him. But it is the government's plan to train up more British people and get them into places like the healthcare and other sectors. And that's what the government is going to drive forward. And I'm sure that he'll be interested in the announcements by the Work and Pension Secretary as she lays out our steps earlier later in this week about getting people back into work. But this particular petition is not a serious proposal or one that any serious government should follow. But I do recognise, as my honourable friend said, the underlying concerns raised by the petition and that my constituents have on migration. Migration must be controlled, and the government has rightly taken steps to bring down net migration to sustainable levels. We will not tolerate the vile trade of human smuggling, the criminal gangs that are exploiting vulnerable people and making millions at the expense of our national security. This is not immigration, this is lawlessness, and that's why the government is investing in the new Border Security Command, delivering crackdowns on smuggling networks, increasing enforcement and expediting removals. In the last 6 months alone, 16,400 people without any right to be in the UK have been returned, and I know the Minister and his Home Office team are working hard on this, and this is real action, not just words. Okay.
Member, this is the last time I'm interviewing. He says that 16,000 people with no right in this country have been deported. I agree with that figure, but is he aware that most of these are overstayers on student visas or work visas, and they've been paid £3,000 to be deported, and not one of these people came over on small boats.
Well, the fact is that this government is getting on with deportations, and we didn't see that under the last government. And indeed, they pursued a policy of Rwanda, which cost the taxpayer millions of pounds and only sent 4 volunteers. So what we're seeing from this government is real action on this. And the government knows that secure borders are not an option, they are a necessity. Legal migration, on the other hand, is another matter entirely. But shutting off our borders to all might be the simple gimmick that some in this House support. But it's a serious issue and not one for snake oil solutions. This is why we must take a balanced approach, one that invests in training and upskilling British workers to fill more vacancies in crucial sectors like healthcare, while also ensuring that overseas workers with the skills we need come here and contribute to our society. Beyond economics, this is about the very fabric of our society. In Burton and Uttoxeter, we see the diverse community that we have because of migration. While Muslims observe Ramadan in their mosques, local Christians are helping the homeless, the Polish community are shopping in the mini-market, and the Burton Caribbean Centre is blasting out soul music. This makes us a better place. And today, as we mark Commonwealth Day, I'm reminded of the contribution those nations and their people have made and continue to make to our country. Earlier today, I was at Burton Town Hall where Mayor Sheila McKiernan and her cadet raised the Commonwealth flag. Sheila reminded us of the 6 Commonwealth values. Number 4 is tolerance, respect and understanding. And in this debate, too often, we can forget that people are at the centre of it. People who contribute, who build, who enrich the very communities that they join. From the engineers that build our infrastructure to the care workers looking after the elderly, these are people that are integral to our national story and always have been. I'm proud to be British because of those fundamental values of tolerance and respect for others. That's how I was brought up in school, and that's what my parents taught me. We owe it to the British people to have a debate and immigration system which is worthy of those values and worthy of the complexity of this issue. Not slogans, not hysteria. Thank you.
Carla Denyer.
Thank you, Dr. Huck. I'm grateful to I'll start again. Thank you, Dr. Huck. I am grateful to serve under your chairship. I would usually say how pleased I am to be able to speak in this debate as well, but I have to admit that I'm conflicted about being here today, because I could not disagree more strongly with the demands this petition makes. And yet, the thousands who've signed it have rightly identified that we do face deep, deep challenges in this country, that people are being badly let down, that people are struggling. And those who've signed this petition want answers. They want politicians like us to take bold, decisive action that will genuinely change people's lives for the better. Let me be very clear. Stopping migration is not the answer to that problem. In fact, it's the opposite. But we do nobody any favours by pretending that the problems are not there. This petition captures a view of migration that I fundamentally disagree with, but it is a view that is clearly widespread. So I want to directly address the many people who've signed this petition and all those who are feeling frustrated, left behind, and ignored. I want to give another view of the problems that we face as a country and to give people another way forward. One that is determined to change things for the better, that is positive in the face of negativity and resolutely stands up to those spreading misinformation and prejudice from wherever it comes. So, I will start with the positive. I'm proud to represent my constituency of Bristol Central, which is apparently the most pro-immigration constituency in the country. I know that feeling isn't universal across the UK, so I want to explain why I and so many of my constituents feel that way. The truth is, migration is good for this country. People come from across the world because they want to be part of our communities. They do vital work, as has already been discussed, in our hospitals, in our schools, in our GP surgeries. They care for our children, and for our grandparents. They start businesses, they create jobs, they pay tax, they give to charity. Take a look at Spain. Last year, Spain's economy grew by 5 times the Eurozone average and more than the US. Why is that? Because by welcoming immigration, the government boosted demand in the economy and filled their labour shortages. Now, economic growth is not the best ever measure of the benefit to citizens, and I'll come to that in a moment. But to pretend that migration is a problem and not an opportunity is a disservice to both people who've grown up here and people who've chosen to make the UK their home. This government's economics watchdog tells us that higher migration leads to lower government deficits and debt. So instead of grasping the huge opportunity that is people moving here to be part of our communities and contribute to our economy, the government is subjecting immigrants to harsh, arbitrary visa restrictions, forcing many to leave their families behind. One man's economic dependence is another man's children, for example, and putting many into jobs, such as in the care sector, where they are at threat of very poor treatment in those jobs because they are under threat of deportation at any time. I know now that a lot of people feel very protective of this country, and so do I. We should want to protect this country, our home, and a place where so many incredible things have been invented and created, and we have such a strong culture. You know, inventions from the electric motor to penicillin to the first ever website, although arguably that's had some cons as well as pros. The UK is a wonderfully creative culture and economy, has the most beautiful countryside, the most talented people. We should be proud and protective of this country, and I want to be. But protective of this country against whom? Who does it need protecting from? I agree with the petitioners when they say that we can't even look after the people we have here at the moment. But why is that? It is absolutely true that there are people and powers in this country that are making life harder for a lot of Brits, making it harder for families to feed their children or pay the bills, to get a doctor's appointment, to get on the housing ladder, or even get a council house. But that isn't the people who've moved to the UK from elsewhere. It's big corporations paying poverty wages and then taking their profits out of the country. It's energy companies hiking their bills time and time again while polluting our environment. Water companies making us pay for the privilege of having sewage pumped into our waterways. It's the landlords, I'll make a little more progress if that's okay, it's the landlords who own hundreds of properties, putting up the rent every few months out of all proportion to their income, so people are paying more and more of their wage packet each month. And it's the big developers prioritising profit by building luxury developments rather than the affordable homes that we need. It's years and years of deliberate underfunding by governments that have brought our public services to their knees. None of this is inevitable. If the government chooses, they could raise the minimum wage so that it's genuine enough to live on. They could take action on spiralling bills, put an end to rip-off rents, build the affordable housing we so desperately need. But for some rich and powerful people, they have an interest in keeping rents high, or in allowing public services to be sold off to the highest bidder, or letting the rich get richer while the rest of us struggle. For them, rather than answering difficult questions about why this economy has been designed in a way that benefits them, it's easier to point the finger at migrants. Now, it's not always easy to stand up and tell the truth when you're swimming against the tide of what people across the country are being told day in, day out, by public figures, by newspaper headlines, by posts on X. It's not easy to challenge the perceptions that have become the mainstream. But we have to, because as long as we chase false solutions to our problems and ignore the real sources of those problems, these things that we care about, how much money we've got in our pocket, whether we've got a safe, warm, secure home, a roof over our head, public services, they won't improve. Now, I'm going to have to turn to the negative for a moment. There is a serious problem of racism in this country, and especially in debates around immigration. That is not to say that everyone who has concerns about immigration is racist, though I fully expect that I may have my speech characterised as such. But we need to be honest about the fact that racism is thriving in this country. Like a hideous parasite, it feeds off people's fear and suffering and is nurtured by politicians and media outlets that benefit from finding someone else to blame. Last summer in Southport, we saw a horrific attack against children, and that scared us all. Such horrors make us angry, and rightfully so. But just as unacceptable and scary is what happened next, and how that anger was deliberately misdirected towards totally innocent people, towards black and brown families minding their own business who are no more responsible for the behaviour of one young man who happens to be the son of immigrants than I am responsible for the behaviour of all other left-handers. Those despicable scenes that we saw in the riots are a chilling snapshot and a reminder of what is happening in this country and what I am here today to speak against. A spiral of misdirected blame, anger and fear which fixes nothing, helps nobody and harms many. So I would like to ask the Minister, when he comes to respond, to not focus only on the easier, perhaps, but not entirely honest answer of being tough on migration, but instead to meet these petitioners with sincerity about the challenges we face and how we can really tackle them. To quote the petitioners one last time, we believe that we can't even look after the people we have here at the moment. They are right. Successive governments have failed. The people in this country failed to provide jobs with fair wages, affordable housing, affordable energy, access to healthcare. I could go on. And rather than solutions, millionaire politicians and millionaire media moguls have inundated our phones, our TVs, our newspapers with images and messages depicting immigrants as the source of all our problems. People are struggling. They're worried about not being able to pay their bills, about not getting paid enough, about their safety. And an overwhelming tide of loud voices is telling them who to blame. That doesn't ease their worry. It doesn't stop their struggling. It capitalises on their anger for political gain at the expense of some of the most hardworking and sometimes vulnerable people in this country. Now, it's a story as old as time, to blame the stranger, the newcomer, the one who looks different. No one ever beat the story by accepting the narrative. No one ever overcame it by validating it. People's feelings about being let down are valid, but the direction they're being pointed is not. And it's the responsibility of all of us in this House, and especially the government, to be really truthful, confront the real issues, and not let people's pain be channeled into hatred. Thank you, Dr. Huck.
Josh Newbury.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to be speaking under your chairmanship, especially given that this is my first speech here in Westminster Hall. I'd like to thank my honourable friend and my constituency neighbour, the member for Lichfield, for introducing this debate so thoughtfully and in such a balanced way, as has been said by several members today. It's not gone unnoticed that my constituency of Cannock Chase was amongst the highest for numbers of signatures on this e-petition. The petition, as has been rightly pointed out, is a signal to the House about how people feel about immigration and the real impact on their lives. It's our responsibility as members of this House to acknowledge this. It's also our responsibility, I believe, to be clear that discussing immigration and the strains that immigration leads to is not racist, it's not intolerant, it's a legitimate part of our democracy in the same way public debate over any other issue is. It's important for us to discuss the impacts of high levels of immigration, particularly where they're seen over a short period of time, and particularly where that immigration is concentrated in certain cities, towns or villages. The impact of that rapid rise in population in that context is not dissimilar to large new housing estates being built over a few years, except of course with house building, we can to some extent through the planning system make sure that mitigation is put in place, and allow for a direct transfer of cash from developers to infrastructure. We can, and I'm sure we will, debate whether the planning system delivers infrastructure quickly enough, but the bottom line is that rapid immigration to particular areas are far harder to plan for and therefore to address. Now, over the last 2 decades or so, several pots of government funding have attempted to address that point, like the Migration Impact Fund introduced under the last Labour government, and latterly the Controlling Migration Fund under the Coalition and Conservative governments. However, those pots are often funding efforts that, like encouraging GP registration amongst new migrants, to reduce the usage of urgent and emergency care. And whilst that's positive for demand on services and certainly for the public purse, it often doesn't address the core issues with a lack of infrastructure, like the number of places at local GP surgeries or schools. I believe that we need to revisit that question of how we make up for the impact of immigration on a very local level where people are feeling the effects most. But ultimately, for all of us here today, we're here to discuss why it is that hundreds of thousands of people have chosen to sign this petition. For some, it might be a worry about the pressures on housing, schools, healthcare, or an acknowledgement of the simple fact that net migration has been left to soar for far too long. As my honourable friend, a member for Lichfield, mentioned, net migration has reached staggering levels in recent years, and it was never reduced to the levels that the previous government aimed for. Yes, of course, happy to.
A measured speech, unlike the one that came before him. And I just wonder if he might chart that in practical terms, because last year there were 700,000 new GP registrations. No government could cope with that, Conservative or Labour. You just can't cope with that scale of growth, in demand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Absolutely, I agree with the honourable member on that point. I think those of us who've had high levels of house building are seeing that, for example, and I'm sure that's reflected in areas that have had high levels of immigration. I think we need to make sure wherever there's a rapid growth in population that proper planning is in place, and I worry that that for a very long time hasn't been happening. GP registrations are a particular pressure point, and I recently had a round table with all the general practices in my area, and they were telling me about how they currently feel at capacity, over capacity in many cases, with further house building coming down the line, and they worry that we haven't got that forward planning in the NHS. And the NHS is often quite slow to catch up, and I can say that having worked for an NHS commissioner in a past life, and I think we need to acknowledge that we need to do far better on that point. So, as my honourable friend referred to, a key reason for the high levels of immigration we've been seeing has been unchecked issuing of work visas, particularly in sectors with high levels of vacancies like social care. This is why I welcome the government's commitment to finally link up immigration policies with our national strategy for education and skills. Only that will ensure that British people have all the opportunities to upskill, reskill and access those jobs which currently in some cases they don't feel able to. It will also put a greater onus on employers to ensure that they're using work visas for vacancies which genuinely can't be filled by the workforce that we already have. An early priority identified by the Deputy Prime Minister, the Education Secretary and the Home Secretary has been social care, and it's not hard to see why. In many ways, social care epitomises the issues that we're facing with both immigration and workforce planning. We've got an ageing population, so demand for the sector's services is exploding. Pay is generally low, especially given the importance of the work. The wider terms and conditions aren't appealing to many young people starting out their careers, and the opportunities for skills training often aren't there either. Last Friday, I was given a greater insight into the challenges of the care sector when I visited CSPC Healthcare, and I heard about the challenges that they've seen in their sector over the last 12 years they've been operating. They provide domiciliary care in my constituency across Staffordshire and the West Midlands. They told me quite a lot, most of which I'll save for a future debate on social care. One thing they said which struck me was that many agencies, particularly those who are working with overseas recruitment agencies, are sponsoring huge numbers of work visas, only for those workers to find that the amount of work they were promised isn't actually there when they come into the country, get put in, often bust out into a particular town, dropped off. And that's exploitative and an outrage, quite frankly, if immigration figures are being artificially inflated even when our economy doesn't need all of those staff. And that clearly highlights that the reforms we need for both the immigration system and our skills and workforce planning. But the question that must follow all of that is, would suspending all immigration for 5 years really solve all those problems? Our economy relies on workers from abroad to fill gaps in our workforce, in sustaining our vital public services, and a complete shutdown, I fear, would risk huge consequences. In particular, we know that our NHS, for example, relies and will always rely on workers coming to make their home here and contributing to those great institutions. Having worked in our NHS in a past life, I know that skilled staff from other countries, most of them European and Commonwealth nations, are critical to keeping the health service alive. We will always benefit from international skills and talent to keep us globally competitive. But importantly, immigration must never be used as an alternative to training or tackling workforce problems here at home. The previous government's reliance on overseas workers, teamed with a failure to invest in skills here in the UK, left us with an immigration system that was neither properly controlled nor managed, resulting in net migration of almost 1 million people. Now, I think regardless of your stance on immigration control, surely we can all agree that that is unsustainable practically, financially, environmentally, on whatever grounds you care to look at. The decade of decline in skills training, particularly vocational skills, in those sectors with the greatest need, saw employers unable to fill vacancies and therefore with no choice but to either do ourselves as a nation serious economic damage or face eye-watering net migration figures. The work that Skills England is doing with the Migration Advisory Committee will show us the occupation shortages, making sure that people can access the skills training they need to fill vacancies in those sectors, raising growth sustainability across the country and also stopping reliance on overseas recruitment. And I'll finish, if I may, Madam Chair, with a point on dependence and a point on the practicalities of halting immigration for 5 years. On dependence, as several honourable members have mentioned, dependents have been a key component of the rising levels of immigration that we've seen for many years, especially in visa categories where levels were previously very low, such as students. I absolutely sympathise with the view that our points-based immigration system needs to focus on bringing the most economically productive workers into the UK. However, we must also acknowledge that some of the highest skilled, most productive workers, just like British workers, have care responsibilities. Surely we don't want to shut out people purely because they have children or have to care for a sick or elderly parent, for example. What we need is a common sense approach when it comes to dependence. Should a student be able to bring their whole family over with them when they study? In my opinion, no. Should a single mother with 3 children who wants to work as a nurse in our NHS be welcomed? Yes. And I think the vast majority of the public support that pragmatic view. And finally, I sympathise with what I assume the motivations of the creator of this petition are, that being to give the UK breathing space to rebuild our infrastructure, which has been so damaged by the age of austerity, a pandemic and huge levels of net migration. But the reality is that halting immigration for several years or even months would simply create a huge pent-up demand for visas for that period of zero migration. During that time, presumably, people would still be allowed to leave the country, raising the possibility of mass shortage in our workforce. And then when at some point in the future immigration was allowed again, the tidal wave of applications we would have would almost completely overwhelm our visa system, but also the infrastructure that we're most concerned about. A total stop of immigration would therefore be counterproductive to tackling the impacts of immigration that underpin this petition and so much of our national conversation around immigration today. So to conclude, Madam Chair, I hope that the openness and robustness of debate we've seen today will continue. Closing down the debate around immigration with name-calling and demonisation from whatever perspective will close down the chance of us getting to a point where we're able to address all of these issues that we've touched on. I very much welcome the government's choice to grasp the nettle of reforming our skills system and linking it to where job vacancies are, and I hope that we can continue to have that debate in the months and years to come. Thank you.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Lichfield for sponsoring this debate on behalf of the Petitioners Committee. Now, we all want to do things well. I'm sure that is an ambition shared by all honourable members. And immigration done well can be a great thing. It's what I call smart immigration, where you are welcoming people from across the world in numbers that can be sensibly absorbed into the existing population, with skills that are required, people who want to integrate, to work and to grow within communities and to learn the language. That is a great thing, and we have a long history until the last sort of 25 years of actually getting that right. The other thing we want to do as a Parliament surely is when we're looking at strategy and planning, our constituents expect us to do a good job. So when we look for the next 20 years ahead, and we see that the forecasts are for population growth of some 10 million people, give or take, let's call that 500,000 a year, the vast majority of that is through inward migration. And you then say, OK, so how are we going to plan for that? Where's the infrastructure? Where's the homes? Where's the doctors? Where are the hospitals and everything else? And in a sense, the challenges the government currently faces, and there are many, which we all recognise, is really dealing with the existing challenges. And I suspect there's very little real planning to say, well, the 1.5 million homes that the government is planning to build in this Parliament, that will really barely alleviate the existing population's housing challenges, let alone 500,000 people more coming to join our population every year over the next 5 years and beyond. So I fear that we're making the same mistake for the next 20 years as the huge mistake that was made 20 years ago. Because if we'd had this sort of debate in about 2005, and if we'd said, we've got a good idea, folks, let's increase the population by 10 million people over the next 20 years, give or take about 17% of the then population, I'm pretty sure all smart honourable members would have said yes. So we've got to build the infrastructure and the houses, etc. And someone quite rightly would have probably said, and will that make us all better off? Because the role of government in this great place is to make our constituents better off. And I think if you plan for something and you deliver it well, then you can achieve great results. But if you don't plan for something and you allow, regrettably under the previous Conservative administrations under various sort of shades of Liberal Democrat, that if you don't plan for something properly, you have uncontrolled migration, then you have the situation we've had in the last couple of years, where we've had, in 1 year, we had almost 1 million net inward migration, and in a second year, almost 750,000, completely uncontrollable, putting huge pressures on the population. I think the thing to focus on, to bring people together in this sensitive debate, actually is about population. And if you want population growth, plan for it, make sure that it's going to make everybody better off, and then deliver it. And the interesting point is, of course, our population has never been bigger. According to official numbers, it's a whisker under 70 million people. So we're not short of people in this country. And we've got, give or take, 7, 8 million people economically inactive. We've got over 5 million people on out-of-work benefits. So surely before we say, well, we will need another 500,000 a year every year in order to provide the labour force for the various services that we need to fill, we should be training up and skilling our own people. And I'd be delighted to give way to the honourable member.
Thank the gentleman for giving way, and also thank him for the sensitive way and he's navigating himself through this. But is it not the case that people who are defined as economically inactive include people who are retired? As a suggestion, we go around the golf courses and bingo halls of our constituency and get these people into the workforce, building houses for us. Is that the solution to our economic problems in this country?
I'm most grateful to the honourable member. No, the point is actually, of course, life expectancy has grown, to his point. The pension age is growing because we're healthier, and that's a great thing, and people enjoy work. Work is a great thing. But the real point is we've got some 5 million plus people who are not of retirement age, who we need to get back into the workplace. And we want a world-leading benefit system that looks after the genuinely vulnerable, the genuinely sick, the genuinely unemployed looking for work. I would have thought we could all agree on that. But let's look at what really did work very well. Back in the 80s and early 90s, we had net inward migration of around 30 to 50,000 a year on average. Some years there was a little bit of net emigration, and it was working well. And people came to work, they integrated, and guess what? Our economy was growing at 2.5% to 3.5% a year. Everybody was getting better off. We had real per person wage growth above the rate of inflation of some 2.5% per annum in the 1990s. We're now in a situation because we've got no GDP growth and we've got significant population growth through inward migration, where we're all getting poorer per person. And this is one of the challenges that we all face. So if we know it worked back then maybe we should be willing to learn the lessons of history. And that was a time when actually there was no immigration debate, interestingly, really until about the early 2000s. It wasn't an issue because it was working well in numbers that were of a quantity that could be sensibly absorbed. And people were getting richer, and that is a good thing. So I think my view is that actually we're not short of people. And there is an anxiety by those who signed this petition that the population growth is too great. We can't cope with our existing population, and there is a need for pause. Now, a policy of net zero immigration, one in, one out, there's about 400,000 people leave the UK every year. You could welcome a similar number, and that will sort of ebb and flow. As long as it's highly skilled, highly qualified, where we've got shortages, as we train our own people. The interesting thing back in the 80s was our healthcare system, the NHS, was working very well. And
it's funded very well as well.
Say again?
It's funded very well as well.
And it was working well, and we had people coming from around the world to help the NHS back then, but we were training our own. And that was a great thing. And it comes back to the point, what's happened in the last 15 years is the complete failure to deliver for population growth at every level. The madness of capping the training of our own people who wanted to be nurses or doctors. Ludicrous. Absolute ludicrous. And we sort of encouraged businesses to say you don't need to invest in training, you can just bring in people from overseas. And what happened was that brought in low-skilled, lower-cost labour from overseas that we were told by the authorities and by the ONS and the OBR or its predecessors would be a good thing for the country. But now we've been told by the OBR, that's just sort of caught up with things, that actually lower-skilled, lower-cost labour never contributes financially into the economy more than it takes out. Of course, I will give way to my honourable name.
In anticipation of our trip to Clapham, perhaps. So there is another economic point that's not been made so far in the debate, and it's this, that if you allow for the kind of incoming populations that he's described, you stultify the economy. So instead of investing in technology, in labour saving, in creating the high-tech, high-skilled economy which we can compete with across the globe, you reinforce an economy which has high levels of labour, usually unskilled, lowly paid labour, and you weaken our productivity and competitiveness. And that is precisely the other economic effect which this policy has had over time.
The honourable member makes a splendid economic point, which I was indeed coming on to, because actually, the thing is, it's basic economics. If you have a labour shortage, then employers have one of two choices. They can either say, well, I need to pay higher wages, which reflects what the honourable lady was indicating earlier, or you can't afford that labour, so you essentially say, I need to invest in capital equipment that is more productive, and that's actually what happened. And in the 80s and 90s, businesses were investing in capital equipment, and that's why we became ever more productive, and that's why we got richer. And so that's the key thing. And I think that from a legal migration standpoint, if we implement it well, highly skilled, highly trained, where you know it's going to contribute to the various sectors, then it's a good thing, hugely welcomed, I think, across the country. And it sort of takes you back to where I think things were sort of 25 to 35 years ago. Done badly, like anything in life, you end up with problems. And that's why I think we've ended up in the situation we are, because of the failures of the previous regime. That's the issue of legal migration. It should actually, with competence and delivery, be sortable. But the British people are are very anxious about the pressures on housing, on public services, and that's driven by the pressures of population growth. And the challenge for this government is trying to deal with the huge problems that it's inherited, as well as the potential population growth. So, in a sense, if you said, well, we can't cope with population growth because we need to deal with the current challenges, I think it may make life easier for the government, because otherwise the government will be constantly chasing its tail and may never catch up. Which brings us to the issue of illegal migration, which I would have thought we should all be able to agree on, in a sense that if something's illegal, we should stop it. But that requires, in many different ways, that requires, back to what I was saying earlier, you've got to do something well. You've got to be competent. And occasionally, it requires a bit of courage. And interestingly, credit where credit's due, the previous Labour administration in the 2000s, when we had significant numbers seeking asylum, significant illegal immigration, which was then not on boats, it was in lorries and vans and things, and the government was doing quite a good job. It was catching people, and it was saying, thank you very much for your application, but actually, you're an economic migrant, you've come here illegally, and we're going to thank you, but say, no, you can't stay. And the government was removing some 40-odd thousand people a year, and it was assessing asylum applications in 2 to 3 weeks, with a couple of weeks for an appeal, decision made, and then either you stay or you return. I think 2004, the acceptance rate for asylum seekers was about 18 to 20%. It's now about somewhere in the sort of the 70s. So we have a history of being able to do things well. And I think that's what the British people want. But we've now got illegal... Of course, I'll give honourable way to the sponsoring honourable member.
I really appreciate the honourable member giving way. I note his comments about how things were working in the 80s and 90s. Now, for most of that time period, I was not particularly very old. But the point he's making around the asylum success rates being different then and now, would he agree that actually, on both of those time periods, the UK was subject to the European Court of Human Rights? So if there has been a change, it's probably not because of the court.
Thank you very much. No, it's an interesting. But I think it was about the fact that the government was assessing people quickly and promptly, and I suspect that what you didn't have back then, I may be wrong, stand corrected, is you didn't have a sort of a huge industry of lawfare that had grown up as it has now. But I could be wrong on that. But I think it comes back to this issue of competence. So people now, having stopped people coming primarily illegally in lorries, people now are coming on boats. And what the previous government utterly failed to do, with no strategy whatsoever, was to stop the boats. And there is history of other nations stopping the boats. And the tragedy of it is, as a previous speaker said, that actually, by not stopping the boats, people are dying. Last year, I fear, was the record year. I think a figure of 69 was mentioned, give or take. And so the current policy is the worst of all worlds. Now, it's my opinion, having studied it and read it in great detail, that the 1982 United Nations Treaty, the Convention of the Law at Sea, gives us the legal right to safely pick people up out of boats and safely take them back to France. There is also, under that same treaty, there is a legal obligation on our good friends, the French, to do exactly that. They have a legal obligation that they are failing to do. And we know it works because the Belgian authorities, they pick up boats that tried to leave their shores, they took them back, and the whole thing stopped very quickly. What that requires, of course, is competence and political courage, which we've not seen anything of in the last 6 years by either government. The government has a strategy at the moment, and I hope the Minister will address this in his remarks, which is to smash the gangs and pray that will stop the boats. But the evidence so far, here we are some 7 or 8 months into this administration, and actually I think the numbers are some 20% higher than in the comparable period. And we know that last year some 36,000 people came across on the boats. And this is costing the country billions and billions of pounds. It's quite hard to get a sense of how many billions, because it's being spent in so many different ways. But it's costing the country billions of pounds. It's also led to the destruction of thousands and thousands of jobs in hotels across the country, in the hospitality sector. And it's also added, of course, to significant extra pressure on homes and housing, because I think we've had some 150,000 have come across on boats. Very, very few have been returned. There was that successful return of 4 people to Rwanda at a cost of many hundreds of millions of pounds. So the question for the Minister is, how long will they carry on with this policy of smashing the gangs before accepting that it's not working and that it won't work? And that's a very important point that I've previously asked the Secretary of State for, and we're sort of still waiting for an answer.
I want to just to be helpful.
Most grateful.
I'm extremely grateful that you can move away a second time. It's very generous of him. I have some figures which I hope will help him. He asked how much it's costing. What we do know is that £3 billion was allocated to housing asylum seekers in hotels, averaging about £8 million per day. £8 million could be spent on the desperate, the needy, the dispossessed in our country.
I'm most grateful, and actually, but I think the real number is many, many billions higher. And not only have we got that cost, and of course, this cost could be 10 billion a year. That's almost like 10 times the winter fuel allowance, just to put it in one perspective. There's another issue here, which is that there is a degree of illegal working going on in this country, which is completely off the scale, often unreported on, and it is, for example, in the fast food delivery companies. Give or take, 40 to 50% of all fast food deliveries are now being carried out by people who are on sub-accounts that they rent from the original account holder with these delivery companies, and they pay 50, 60 quid a week. They get it from Facebook. And why would you pay someone else for a sub-account if you can have the original account for free? There can only be one reason, and that is because you are working illegally. And if any of you enjoy the pleasures of fast food deliveries to your home, I would just say to anybody, look at the person delivering it compared to the person who was supposed to deliver it. And you will very, very often see that it's not the same person. So there is a scale of illegal working which has the sad effect, and I've seen it and spoken to people in certain towns, of suppressing wages of genuine British workers who want to earn a good living, and were earning a good living, by fast food delivery on bikes or e-bikes or whatever. And so again, there is a serious lack of fairness, which is completely unjust. And there is another level of illegal migration which I think needs touching on, Madam Chair, if you will bear with, because there is a strange thing that's going on now, and it's happening in my constituency of Boston, Skegness and elsewhere, of illegal, legal migration. So where you've got people who are coming here on a visitor visa, and this is a whole racket that's going on, and it's massive business. And then when they arrive here, they go to a high street store, high street shop, which they do in Boston, and they get told how to fiddle the figures and the numbers and the form to show that actually they were here pre-2020 and therefore they can subscribe under the EU settlement scheme, even though they've never been here before. And so that then gives them a national insurance number for overseas, and that then entitles them to work, and then soon after that entitles them to claim benefits, and you end up with another level of illegality that is much, much greater than anybody dares talk about up and down the country. And it is incumbent upon this government, and I would hope everybody would agree, once again, competence in enforcement will stop this level of abuse, because it is suppressing the wages of British people, and it is adding huge pressure on housing demand when housing is at a critical shortage. I welcome the new Madam Chair. It's lovely to see you. And so we have to get on top of the illegality, whilst recognising, I believe, that legal migration, done well, is a very smart thing to do. Done badly, as it has been in recent years, has, I think, led to the massive challenges and concerns that I think many, many millions of people, tens of millions of people across the UK have. So, in summary, Madam Chair, I think it's about doing things well. It's about stopping illegal migration by doing the job properly so that we stop it. And it's about being smart about how we motivate our existing population, getting people skilled up and back into work, so that actually we don't need to rely on large amounts of inward migration when we're paying huge amounts for people to stay at home. That cannot be smart, good government, and I think any government, if they do that well, they will have the gratitude of the British people. And I think the British people just want someone to do this job properly. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I call Ollie Glover, Lib Dem front bench spokesperson.
Thank you, David Vaughan. It is an honour to serve under your chairmanship, and can I start by thanking all the participants in this interesting and wide-ranging debate, and in particular the member for Lichfield for his comprehensive and very thoughtful introduction. He quite rightly reminded us that this is a matter of great importance to many people, and we should not demonise or polarise people for their views in this discussion, and we should be willing to listen and discuss the topic, as indeed we have today. The Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings also recognised the importance of discussing this topic and highlighted his view of the country being full and migrants consuming public services. But in relation to the Clapham Omnibus, and I should point out that underground trains and suburban trains are also available as public transport options in that suburb, I'd perhaps encourage him to take a trip on said omnibus. He may be surprised that the viewpoints of residents in that area are rather different to those from his own constituency, with that area having voted heavily to remain and being very diverse and cosmopolitan in many of its features. The Honourable Member for Burton and Uttoxeter talked about the need to tackle illegal migration and also recognised the long history of migrant contributions to our country. And the Honourable Member for Bristol Central also highlighted the importance of having a respectful debate on the discussion and recognised the fact that our housing is under pressure for a whole range of reasons. The Honourable Member for Cannock Chase highlighted the ageing UK population and how that drives part of the need for migrant labour in this country. And he highlighted how the planning system has not been effective at meeting population increases and ensuring that infrastructure and public service provision catches up with it. And that was a point that was also made by the Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness. And he cited the failure of successive governments, as well as making some positive comments about the Labour government of the early 2000s and the need for UK skills investment, a point also very well made by the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings. In terms of Liberal Democrats of different hues, I'd like to assure him our colours have always been orange, and we would, of course, welcome suggestions for any changes to our colour palette. I think, in terms of my own views on this, it's important to reflect on an overall philosophical point. I would say my strong view is that people as individuals, on average, have far more in common and common needs than difference, and that's far more important than where they came from. And I feel this partly because I have Polish heritage. My Polish mother moved to this country in the 70s and has spent decades always working here and contributing to UK life. She has certainly fully integrated, perhaps aside from the occasional accent or getting her A's and thes mixed up. And also, and on that point, so often discussions about immigration and immigrants are softened when the debate turns away from the general and to specific and personal individuals and relationships. And an example of this was I had met local business owners at the Railway Inn pub in Culham in my Oxfordshire constituency. And initially very frustrated and hostile conversation about immigration was suddenly softened somewhat when I talked about my Polish mother, and the people in the discussion talked about their own heritage and many people that they know in the area who have come from other countries and recognise that individually they make a strong contribution. So it's important to remember there are many types of migrant who have very different reasons for why they come here. and it's therefore essential that we examine the basis and reasons for people's major concerns about migration. In terms of irregular migration, I think we can all agree, and we have during this debate, that we want to stop these dangerous channel crossings. And unfortunately, the previous Conservative government failed to tackle them and arguably made the situation worse. Human trafficking gangs responsible for these crossings continue to operate with virtual impunity. We've seen barriers erected to international cooperation by the previous government that make it harder to crack down on cross-border people smuggling. And that government's inability to efficiently process asylum claims meant those without a genuine right to stay were not being swiftly returned. And as has been stated by the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings, that continues to cost a great deal to the taxpayer in terms of hotel and other forms of accommodation. It's clear that change is desperately needed, so it's right that the new Labour government is taking steps to stop these channel crossings, and cracking down on the criminal trafficking gangs responsible will be crucial. And in the Liberal Democrats, we want to ramp up domestic enforcement against these gangs, including by establishing a new single enforcement body to crack down on modern slavery in the UK, which is how so many of those gangs make their money. But we also need to look at the root causes of why migration is happening to Europe and the United Kingdom, because we are not alone in facing this challenge. This is very much a continent-wide problem. We need to work constructively and collaboratively with our European allies, particularly France via Europol. We need to create an effective and morally appropriate deterrent, for example, deportation back to home countries if applications are rejected, which comes back to the importance of tackling that backlog and having an efficient process for processing applications. And we need to consider the root causes which lead people to attempt to reach Europe and the UK, which vary: war, oppression, climate change, and yes, a lack of economic opportunity. And we need to further consider what safe and legal routes for people to be able to apply for asylum and refugee status from abroad may exist. Turning to legal migration, Liberal Democrats agree that our country needs a fair and effective immigration system that enforces the rules on who has the right to stay in our country. Unfortunately, we've seen nothing of the sort from the previous Conservative government, with a chaotic approach of making and breaking headline-grabbing targets that has shattered public trust and left the system in a shambolic state. Net migration figures reach record highs on the Conservatives' watch, and their inability to efficiently process asylum claims meant that those without a genuine right to stay were not being swiftly returned. Now, it's clear that the new government has a mammoth task ahead, rebuilding an immigration system that works for our country and economy whilst fixing public trust in the process. And many speakers in today's debate have talked about the challenges with the planning system in eroding the public's trust. Certainly in my constituency, which has seen 35% population growth in 20 years in South Oxfordshire and the Vale of Whitehorse district councils, a system which doesn't match infrastructure and public services to population growth erodes public confidence in the entire system. And as the member for Bristol Central said, having public services that work is going to be essential for regaining that trust. Now, over the past 2 years, the two main reasons for immigration from the data that we have been work and study. Recent years have also seen a much higher number of people arriving for humanitarian reasons than in the past, notably via the Ukraine schemes, the Afghan resettlement schemes, and as British national overseas status holders from Hong Kong, who have quite rightly been welcomed here because of the oppression of the Chinese government. Migration is currently a source of population growth, and migrants tend to be younger on average than the general population, which can be useful when our own population the current population is ageing. Now, as has been said, the number of non-UK nationals in employment is greater than the 3.5 million people aged 16 to 64 who are out of work in late 2024, but who wanted to work. And of these, 1.5 million were unemployed, meaning they were actively looking for a job, while 2 million were assessed as economically inactive, meaning they were not able to work. And if we do want to reduce migration and have more British jobs for British people, as one Prime Minister once said, we need to examine why our economy is so dependent on migrant labour in many sectors. And we do need to recognise the risk that a suspension, as suggested by this petition, for 5 years of immigration for 5 years would likely lead to labour shortages across the UK's labour market, harming both the private sector and public services. I'm happy to give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Of course, he's right that if we didn't get the people who are unemployed and could work into work, the circumstances would be as he describes them. But we do need to get those people. into work. Many of them want to work. Many of the young people, the 1 million NEETs, don't have the skills necessary to work, and they deserve our support. They must come first, surely.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for his intervention, and I commend him for his commitment that he discussed in his speech when he was in government to improving skills training. But I think the challenge as to how we get there is significant, which I will come on to discuss in my concluding remarks. I mean, in my constituency, there are examples of organisations that are intrinsically international in nature. The European Space Agency, for example. I met two of their directors, one British and one French, and many other science and high-tech employers, such as Tokamak Energy and Milton Park and Astroscale and Harwell Campus, also rely on those specialist skills which depend on a global labour market. Our commitment to rearming and boosting the defence sector will also increase the demand for labour. And that's why we do need to consider the steps and programmes that would be necessary before we do any clampdown on legal migration, which also is important to address that balance between improving the labour supply and incentivising it through better pay and remuneration, but considering our collective willingness to pay higher prices as a result of increased pay and labour costs, not least for food, if we do that. I look forward to hearing the Minister's response.
Katie Lamb, Opposition spokesperson.
Thank you, Dame Siobhan. It is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair this afternoon. I am grateful to the Petitions Committee and to the well over 200,000 members of the public who have requested that we debate this topic today. Some may be uncomfortable with the petition before us, which calls us to suspend all immigration for 5 years. This would represent a radical departure from the status quo. Some may even be tempted to be dismissive of it. But that reaction would be wrong, and I commend the Honourable Member for Lichfield for taking this so seriously. This petition is an expression of the deep and entirely legitimate frustration that the British public feels towards the way that successive governments of different political parties have handled immigration. I say this frustration is entirely legitimate because the level of migration to this country has been too high for decades and remains so. Every election-winning manifesto since 1974 has promised to reduce migration. As my right honourable friend, the member for North West Essex, has said, the last government, like the governments before them, also promised to do exactly that. But again, like the governments before them, did not deliver. My honourable friend, the member for West Sussex, summarised it well in a speech he gave in this room a few months ago. Immigration is the biggest broken promise in British politics, and probably the single biggest reason that British politics is so broken. But this isn't just about the betrayal of the public's trust, terrible though that is. Increasingly, people can see the tangible downsides of high immigration in their own lives. People can see it in their wages, which are stagnating because they are being undercut. They can see it in their soaring rents, in how hard it is for their children to get on the housing ladder, in the cohesion of their communities, and in the pressure on their GPs, dentists and infrastructure. Several members today have mentioned the public's fears about this, including the Honourable Member for Cannock Chase. So those of us in Westminster should not be surprised to see members of the public demand a radical change of course. Elected representatives must respond to these material concerns, not with platitudes, but with actual change. Fail to do so, and we will see demands for a total shutdown on immigration grow louder and louder. I don't believe that we should suspend all immigration. Like the Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness, I believe that a small number of highly skilled people can make a valuable contribution to this country, bringing their talents, experiences and ideas with them. But our current system does not select for such individuals. In part, this issue is about quantity. Over the last few years, this country has seen unprecedented levels of immigration, over 1 million people per year from 2022 onwards, and net migration at or expected to be at least 820,000 people, as we have already heard from my right honourable friend, the member for South Holland and the Deepings. That means adding as many people to Britain's population as live in Leeds, this country's third largest city, every single year. Every person who comes to Britain needs infrastructure, housing and healthcare, even if they are highly skilled and keen to assimilate. And assimilation itself, bringing new migrants into the fabric of our communities, becomes much more difficult with people arriving here at anything like this kind of scale. But this issue is not just about quantity. It is also about the people we welcome to Britain. It should be a fundamental principle of our system that people who come to this country do not cost more than they contribute. What they pay in tax should, at the least, cover the costs of the public services that they use. This is the opposite of the situation we have now. In fact, only a small proportion of those who have come to this country over the last few years are likely to be net lifetime contributors. After just 5 years here, many of these migrants will become eligible for indefinite leave to remain, or ILR. With ILR status, migrants gain access to universal credit and social housing, surcharge-free access to the NHS, and much more. According to analysis from the Centre for Policy Studies, over 800,000 migrants from the past 5 years could soon claim ILR at an estimated lifetime cost of £234 billion. That's equivalent to £8,200 per household, or nearly 6 years of defence spending. If we accept that the immigration policy of the past few years was a mistake, then we should make every effort to reverse its long-term consequences. That is why the Conservative Party is advocating that the qualifying period for ILR should be extended. This would give us an opportunity to review time-limited visas issued over the last 5 years. ILR conditions should be tightened to ensure that future applicants are genuinely likely to be net contributors. Those who have come here legally on time-limited visas and who have not contributed enough should be expected to leave. But it is not enough to correct past mistakes. Moving forward, we must also design a sustainable immigration system which addresses concerns about both immigration volumes and the people we are allowing to come here. Those who do come to Britain should be genuinely high-skilled, with the capacity to support themselves and their families without relying on public funds. As my right honourable friend, the member for North West Essex, has previously argued, culture also matters. We must recognise this fact and design our system with assimilation in mind. It is both fair and sensible to prefer immigration from societies which are more like our own.
Would my honourable friend allow me?
With pleasure.
I'm extremely grateful to my friend for giving a compelling summation of both the debate and the problem. She will know that Trevor Phillips, the Labour politician and columnist, first deconstructed the idea of multiculturalism. His argument was, you perpetuated the notion that cultures could coexist without anything that bound them together, that those cultures would, in the end, segregate and, in his words, create ghettos. It's critically important that we challenge that idea and build a society based on what we share, the things we have in common, the links and bonds that tie a civil society together.
I thank my right honourable friend for his intervention. I think it is important to say, as his intervention reflects, that we absolutely can have a multi-ethnic society, but that it is fundamental that we are one country, one people, with one perspective. The kind of immigration system that I have discussed is the sort of system that the British people have voted for time and time again, limited, selective and tailored to our needs. Unfortunately, I have seen no indication that this government is willing to implement such a system. So will the Minister confirm, please, that the government is not planning to extend the qualifying period for ILR? Can he outline what discussions he and others in his department are having with ministerial colleagues about the impact that new ILR grants will have on public services? Can he tell us whether the government has made any estimation as to the number of people who will receive ILR over the course of this Parliament? And can he outline in detail, and most importantly with a specific time frame, the substantive plans that this government has to address the volumes and impact of immigration, both legal and illegal?
Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And can I start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Lichfield for responding to this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I thought he framed it at the outset in a very sensible and reasonable way, and I know that the whole House will be grateful to the contribution that he has made. I should also begin by saying, Madam Chair, that eagle-eyed members will have noticed that I'm not the member, or the Minister rather, for Migration and Citizenship. She is away on ministerial duty, but given that our national security is underpinned by our border security, I'm very pleased to be here this evening to reply on behalf of the Government. Now, a range of topics have been discussed and a broad range of views have been put forward. And I will come on to some of those areas that have been highlighted during the debate shortly. But before I do, let me take the opportunity to summarise the government's position on these matters. Starting with legal migration. Both the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have been crystal clear that levels are too high and must come down. Net migration rose to a record high of more than 900,000 in the year ending June 2023. And according to the latest figures, estimated net migration was 728,000 in the year ending June 2024. Now, clearly, any debate about this issue needs to recognise the position that this government inherited when taking office. Net migration spiralled out of control in recent years, driven largely by overseas recruitment. We are determined to bring numbers down through continued implementation of tough restrictions on visas, particularly in relation to family members and dependents, and through other measures such as increasing the general salary threshold for skilled worker visas. More broadly, we are focusing on delivering much greater alignment between the immigration and the employment systems. We need a stronger, more effective skills and training offer here in the UK so that vacancies can be filled from the domestic workforce rather than from overseas recruitment. Now, the Independent Migration Advisory Committee has been commissioned to review key sectors, and we will be setting out our long-term plan in an upcoming white paper. Now, the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings raised a point, an interesting point right at the beginning, about economic value and family migrants. And we want to ensure that family immigration rules allow immediate family members to join British or settled relatives in the UK where they can be financially supported and integrate into society. This needs to be balanced with properly managed and controlled migration. Therefore, the Migration Advisory Committee has been commissioned to review the financial requirements in the family immigration rules to ensure that we have a robust basis for change. Turning to illegal migration, again, it is important to recognise the situation we inherited. In 2018, only a few hundred people arrived in the UK by small boat. By the time this government took office, the number was running at tens of thousands a year. Over that period, an entire criminal industry built up around our borders and beyond. The dire consequences of this dreadful trade are familiar to members on all sides. Having gained the upper hand, ruthless smuggling gangs saw the United Kingdom as an easy target. Our border security was relentlessly and repeatedly undermined. Lives have been tragically lost in the Channel and elsewhere, and public confidence in the immigration and asylum systems collapsed. This cannot go on, and since the general election, we've been working at pace to stop the chaos and return order to the system. Now, in the interests of time, and members will no doubt be relieved to hear this, I will refrain from giving an exhaustive account of our approach. But we have, amongst other actions, established the Border Security Command to mobilise various operational agencies against the criminal gangs in an effort backed by 150 million of funding. We've significantly deepened Britain's cooperation with key partners, including France, Germany, Italy and Iraq. We've ramped up illegal working visits and the removals of those with no right to be in the UK, and we've begun work to clear the asylum backlog. There is much more to do on this, which is why we have made secure borders a foundation of our plan for change. And it is why we have brought forward the Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill to strengthen the UK's border security and bring in new counter-terror style powers to dismantle the smuggling gangs. Now, I'll turn now, if I may, Madam Chair, to the substance of today's discussion and the petition which has prompted this debate. And I will directly address the suggestion that all immigration should be suspended for 5 years. The UK has a long history of helping those fleeing conflict, tyranny and persecution. That generosity and compassion is part of our national identity. But let me be absolutely clear. our borders need to be secure and the rules will be enforced. As we've seen over recent years, when that doesn't happen, the consequences are severe. Equally, legal migration has benefited our country in all sorts of ways. For generations, people have come here from around the world to work and contribute to our society. It is in all our interests for the UK to be able to access the best talent from around the world. And this government values and recognises the role that legal migration can play in supporting many sectors of our economy and our essential public services. The issues come when the numbers become unsustainable and the system lacks order and control. Now, I would respectfully make the point to the petitioners, therefore, that the answer to these challenges lies not in the closure of borders or the suspension of immigration, but in making sure our approach is fair and effective and firmly in the national interest. Now, turning to the specific issues that have been raised during the debate, I thought we heard a very interesting speech from the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings. He twice, I think, quoted C.S. Lewis in the context of failure of successive governments, and he's right about that, and that is why this government takes these matters so seriously. He helpfully, I thought, took us through the numbers and illustrated very clearly the scale of the challenge and made some very good points about training and skills. He also mentioned a trip to Clapham, something that did appear to appeal to the member for Boston and Skegness. I should perhaps just gently remind them both that trips to that particular location, including, of course, the Common, haven't always served members of this House particularly well. But I will leave it to their judgment as to whether they perhaps may choose to select an alternative location, but that is for them. The Honourable Member for Burton and Uttoxeter, I thought, made a very important point about the NHS relying on 160,000 workers who've come here from overseas, but also firmly made the point about recognising the need to bring down migration to manageable levels. He spoke about secure borders being essential, and that is why this government is working to ensure that our border security is secure, including, of course, with new legislation. The Honourable Member for Bristol Central was commendably clear in her views. I'm afraid, with great respect, I didn't agree with many of the conclusions, but given the way in which the Honourable Member for Lichfield framed the debate around having a balanced range of views, I thought that she did make a valuable contribution, and she challenged the government to respond in a balanced and fair way, and I'll leave it to her to judge whether she thinks that is the case or not. The Honourable Member for Cannock Chase made his first speech in Westminster Hall, and I congratulate him for it. It gives me the opportunity to reflect on the comments that were made previously in this place by a West Midlands counterpart of his, the Lord Speller. The Lord Speller memorably said that if you want to keep a secret, tell it in Westminster Hall. Well, we'll see whether that proves to be the case today or not. But he did make a number of important points, not least in terms of linking immigration policies with skills, training and education policies. He's right about that, and I can assure him that that is the approach that this government will always seek to take. The Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness made, I thought, a thoughtful and constructive contribution. He spoke about the importance of having a plan, which I think is an entirely fair challenge. I think perhaps he would agree with me that there wasn't one previously, but I hope that he will be patient and in time that he will see that this government does have a plan, that we recognise both the challenges and the opportunities that come from a managed migration policy, and that this government will always approach these matters with the seriousness that they deserve. He suggested that our strategy, I think perhaps a little bit unfairly, was to smash the gangs and pray that it works. Well, I can assure him that isn't our approach. I can tell him that the government is prioritising the important work to tackle organised immigration crime and reduce irregular migration to the UK by adopting a new approach which considers the end-to-end process of organised immigration crime, targeting each stake to make facilitation unviable and to disrupt the activity of the organised criminal gangs. This learns from the success of our world-leading counter-terrorism system. So the new approach to tackling organised immigration crime will prevent, by disincentivising migrants and deterring OCGs from participating in organised immigration crime, pursue, disrupt organised criminal gangs and their criminal activity, protect, by detect and act on organised immigration crime at the border, and prepare to manage, learn from and adapt the UK's response to tackling organised immigration crime. As he will know, none of this is easy, but rather than the gimmicks we've seen previously, we are working properly and at pace to address the issues that he has raised. The Honourable Member for Didcot and Wantage, I thought, spoke very interestingly about his own Polish heritage, and I'm grateful to him for his acknowledgement of the scale of the challenge that we face. And I agree his point about the importance of good functioning public services. The example of the National Space Agency as an employer I thought was a very interesting one, and the government always remains happy to debate these matters further with him in the future. It's good to see the Shadow Minister in her place. I agree with her when she said that we should respond not with platitudes but with real change, and she spoke about a sustainable immigration system that is fair and sensible. Again, she's right about that, and I hope that we can continue to debate these matters in the way that we have done today. Just before she sat down, she asked me a number of questions around ILR, and she'll perhaps understand why I asked the Minister for Migration and Citizenship to write to her with the answers that she has requested, and I hope that that will be satisfactory to her. Madam Chair, let me conclude by offering thanks again to the Honourable Member for Lichfield for his sponsorship of this debate and to all members who have contributed to it. I think that this has been a constructive and thought-provoking debate. As I've set out, the Government is getting on with the job of securing our borders and reducing net migration. In both areas, what matters most is that we restore order and control, because for too long, those essential ingredients have been missing from our systems, but we are determined to put that right because the people of our country deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Dave Robertson to wind up.
Thank you, Chair. Can I say again for the second time in the debate what a pleasure it is to take part in a debate with you and the Chair. Just in summing up, I'd actually like to really thank all right honourable members for being able to come along today and take part in this debate. I think it is one that is obviously a hot button issue across the country, and seeing so many contributions from such a wide range of constituencies, such a wide range of the country and indeed political persuasions is something that we should value. I'd also like to thank all honourable members for the way in which the debate has been undertaken. I think that there is always a risk when it's an issue that's as highly charged as this that you can lose the debate a little bit and descending to some behaviours from all sides, which doesn't befit the best histories of the House. And I don't think that's where this debate went today at all. And in fact, actually, when we're in a situation talking about a topic as complex as this, where we have the member for Boston and Skegness espousing the benefits of migration and the honourable member for Bristol Central discussing the issue that drives people's concerns on immigration, I think we can see that actually this has been a considered debate from all sides, and one which I'm hoping every single one of the petitioners is looking at with interest, and is seeing that actually this is one that everybody across the chamber has put a lot of time and thought into, and one that where we all want to see some movement. We all want to see some movement, not potentially to the same place, but in the same directions. There's widespread agreement on the need to deal with the crisis in the Channel, and that's something that we should applaud. Quite how much of that makes it onto the front pages of the Mail, Express or Guardian tomorrow, we will wait to see. But yeah, if I can just address again the petitioners who actually we are here on their behalf, and I really do hope that they are listening and watching and reading Hansard, and that they are very aware of how serious that all parties are taking this, even if none of the parties that have spoken today are in a position where they can potentially agree to the outcomes that are suggested in the petition.
Thank you very much.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 700824 relating to suspending legal and illegal migration. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.